This program is funded through a More Perfect Union initiative of the National Endowment for the Humanities. All right, with me today is Raffi Andonian, celebrity historian, to explore the American dream.
All right. Well, thank you to Idaho Humanities Council for doing this. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about the American dream across time. I am a celebrity historian. I have a history in the National Park Service, as you can see there in the photo of me years ago on a Civil War battlefield working. And of course, we have fought over the American dream so often, both bloody and not bloody, and including on these battlefields or sometimes in protests. So we're going to walk through a few centuries of seeing how the American dream came to be and what we're fighting over and how it's contested. Looking back to 1607, what many consider the beginnings of the pre-United States. Now, of course, in 1607, there was no United States, but this is the first permanent English colony, which is at Jamestown, Virginia. And it started with the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company was a corporation, and that corporation had a royal charter with King James supporting it, but the corporation had investors that funded this colony to go across the Atlantic Ocean from England to the North American mainland and try to make a profit by bringing back resources, much like you would in a colony, to then produce and manufacture in England. Now, what's fascinating here is a couple of things and why I think of the beginnings of the American dream here. One is that you have this public-private partnership, right? You have the king, the crown, and a corporation working together on this venture, hoping to make money. And two is once the folks that are here in Virginia, or in Virginia, when I say here in North America, but particularly in Virginia, which you see some scenes of here with the James River up in the upper left and a monument to John Smith, who we all know in the middle. And on the right, you see an archaeological site that is still remaining from the era in Jamestown, Virginia today. But when the people were here, the Englishmen, they had a hard time surviving for several years. They needed the help of the local American Indian groups to get by the difficult winters and food supply and just knowing the landscape and the environment around them, as well as diplomatically, because there are different groups that are not always friendly. And so in that context, they first had the help of the indigenous people, but later eventually would no longer have that as they would continue to build rivalries and perhaps not exactly have great relations, right, between American Indian groups and the Englishmen. But down south in Virginia is not the only place that this was happening. While in Virginia, it was a profit motive, up in New England, particularly in Massachusetts, it was more idealistic. Not so much the corporation, not so much about not so much about finding raw materials, but creating an idealistic society. And here is where we often would look to for ideals of the United States when we look backward. On the left is John Winthrop. He gave a famous sermon in 1630, early in Massachusetts' lifespan, that the United States, or what we consider United States today, but Massachusetts particularly for him, this region would be seen as a city on a hill, a shining beacon in the darkness. And you would later hear, for example, President Ronald Reagan refer to a city on a hill in the 1980s. So this still has staying power with us today when we look toward what the United States has to offer, not just the economic opportunity that we see in Virginia, but the ideals of religious freedom and an idealistic society where groups fit together, family structure. A lot of these ideas come from the Puritans in Massachusetts in this period. Now, go 100 years later, in the same place in Massachusetts, in 1749, you have Jonathan Edwards. He gives a sermon also. Now, his sermon is called, one of his many sermons, the famous one is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And this is one of the key pieces of literature and oratory that gives fire to what is now called the Great Awakening, which is a big religious fervor movement that takes place across the North American English colonies in the mid-18th century. And in the process of doing so, there's this idea that while you might sin in the hands of an angry God, there is an opportunity for redemption, an opportunity to redeem yourself and to improve and to be saved again. And these principles, to me, serve into the American dream later because we often think of the United States as a place where you get renewal, a place where you can leave back the sins or the bad things or the bad positions of the old world and come to the United States and visualize and dream all these things that we're seeing, whether it's the economic opportunity that Virginia saw, whether it's the shining city on a hill, the land of opportunity that John Winthrop saw, and for Jonathan Edwards, the opportunity to redeem yourself, to leave back your sins, and to renew and rebirth as an American. Now, these ideas, just a few decades on the tail end of the Great Awakening, come together in the American Revolution. Now, we all know Thomas Jefferson and the 4th of July and the Declaration of Independence, but there's some different origins there, and we can trace that in all kinds of places. But specifically in Virginia, going back, remember where the Virginia Company started there a century and a half prior. There is something called the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And that Declaration of Rights was passed in the Virginia Convention right there in that building, which is the Capitol building in Williamsburg, Virginia, which is still there today. And the person who was the primary drafter for it was George Mason, that you see pictured there. The Declaration of Rights used language like talking about life, liberty, happiness, property. These are all things, concepts, and words that would later be used by Jefferson and a variety of writers, of course, but especially in the Declaration of Independence. And this is done just months prior to what later I should say months prior to the Declaration of Independence. So, of course, people at this point don't know the Declaration of Independence is coming, but later, with this fresh on their minds, this is what Jefferson is thinking about, among other things, to write what he does. And there, for the first time in our conversation here, we see the birth and the notion of a United States. Remember, there was no United States in the prior examples, but later on, when the United States comes about as a country, it leans on those ideas. It draws its history and identity backward to draw upon those stories to help form its identity as a new nation. Because that's part of how you get legitimacy as a country, is to create some kind of common identity. But of course, in this process, not everyone was participating equally. At the same time that you have these declarations of rights and these ideals, you have, of course, American slavery in what is now the United States by the 1770s. And that, of course, is one of the big contentions that comes into play for decades to come in the young country, in the young United States, not only limited to the South, where the slavery existed as an institution, but including in New England, where they profited from the slave trade, trading across the Atlantic Ocean. So, in not participating equally, one way that we can look at this is manifest destiny, as it was known. Manifest destiny, as the term implies, is that it was obvious, it was clear, it was manifest that the United States was destined to cross across North America, the continent, from sea to shining sea, from the East Coast and eventually to the West Coast. That was obvious to the proponents of this ideology. Thomas Jefferson on the left there, famous for the Louisiana Purchase, among other things, right? The person who wrote the Declaration of Independence was visualizing a land of independent yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers are middle-class farmers, independent property owners, which, if you think about it, to this day, we have that ideal, right? What happens when somebody comes out of school? They should, come out of school and buy a house or get married and buy a house, right? We still identify buying a house and maybe the white picket fence with the American dream. And so that notion of owning your little piece of property, your little piece of land, still exists with us today. Now, in the process of doing so, however, manifest destiny is tied to groups that were not participating in it. Look at the painting on the right side there. Very famous in the 1840s, circulating across the United States, depicting manifest destiny, depicting Lady Liberty over there, depicted as a white angelic woman that is crossing the continent across the savages, as they saw, that were on the landscape, bringing civilization to the wild, because we saw the West as wild, which we still to some extent do, despite all the long history that is there. of people, not only from the Spanish colonial days of European descent, but of course, well before any Europeans had ever come to North America. In the process of expansion, intertwined with that was not only some kind of exclusion, if you will, of American Indian groups across the West and of Mexican and other Hispanic groups that were in that region, but also to exclude Black Americans because there was a fight that eventually led to the Civil War with a series of compromises. For example, the Missouri Compromise in 1820, or the Compromise of 1850, or later on the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. All of these are pieces of legislation in the United States Congress that are fought over by slave states and free states. That is, states that had slavery and states that did not have slavery, that wanted their interests to expand out west. And these fights over whether the newest state and the latest state that is coming into the Union from the West should have slavery or not were part of what eventually led to the American Civil War. So tied with this American dream of visualizing the opportunity that we see, both economic and idealistic, both of the farm and the civilization that we thought we were getting across from the East Coast, if you are a English descendant or white American from the East Coast, tied with these is the exclusion and eventually the war. And so now during the Civil War in the 1860s, shortly after that period of the big manifest destiny mentality, you have, of course, the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the defining battles of the Civil War. Civil War, of course, is for 4 years, and there's two main objectives. First, of course, to preserve the Union as the Southern states that formed the Confederacy had left the United States. But they had done so because they wanted to protect their interests in slavery, because they did not think that Abraham Lincoln or others in the North were willing enough to protect slavery enough. Now, Lincoln, in the beginning of the war, did not always see slavery as an important cause to end during in the process of the war. However, during the war, he comes around and says, you know, we need to get to a root cause of this, in part because of Frederick Douglass being on his ear saying, you know, if you preserve the Union without ending slavery, you're going to have the same problem again in the future. So they add the objective of ending slavery to settle this and get this done so they don't have to deal with this again. Well, one of the big places that Lincoln helps announce this, shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation, that is legally trying to declare slaves free, what happens is he speaks at the Gettysburg Address. After the Battle of Gettysburg, just a few months later, when they established the National Cemetery, which you see images of right here on the screen. In the upper right, what I particularly enjoy showing here that I appreciate is the graves of the unknown soldiers, because those graves are so small because they're numbered. They do not have names. Men who sacrificed their identities in order to give what Lincoln called in his Gettysburg Address the last full measure of devotion. But also in his Gettysburg Address, he refers to unfinished work. The unfinished work he refers to is what he would call the new birth of freedom, right in his Gettysburg Address. So what you see here is the Civil War becomes this moment of thinking about who we are as a country and defining and redefining the American dream, the unfinished work that she saw that the country had to get that new birth of freedom. And you notice that that new birth of freedom sounds a lot like the man who gave the sermon for sinners in the hands of an angry God, with, of course, Jonathan Edwards talking about that opportunity for redemption. These ideas and these mindsets permeated were the bedrock of how we thought about ourselves, despite being decades or sometimes centuries apart. One way I feel connected to this is with this pen right here. This is a pen made of the wood of a witness tree, a tree that is that witness that was next to Abraham Lincoln when he gave the Gettysburg Address. And to me, this is a very direct connection to that moment, to understand that we still carry with us today this notion of fighting about the American dream and fighting what that new birth of freedom means and debating what exactly these issues and how they should unfold, whether economically, ideologically, in our identity, and even our history. And this pen was right there to hear Lincoln say those words, not as a pen, as a tree at the time. but now in the form of a pen that I keep with me from my time having worked at the battlefield at Gettysburg and having led thousands of visitors across that very cemetery. Now, the military is an important place where these things play out. Almost a century after the Civil War, and after now we had a constitution that was reworked because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that ended slavery, protected equal rights and equal access, and of course provided voting rights, meaning that they prohibited discrimination based on race. Now, it was still only for men, not including women, but at least what happened in the process here is they tried to, again, uproot the cause of the Civil War, eliminate race-based discrimination, at least legally, but it wasn't over. Almost 100 years later, these issues were still going on. And the reason I point out Harry Truman and World War II, as you see the images of the Second World War and Harry Truman himself here, is because people often forget that in the Second World War, as we fought as an army of liberty, an army that brought liberation to the world from oppression, from Hitler, and of course, ending the war in the Pacific Theater with the atomic bomb, justifying it because we were bringing our ideals. And of course, eventually built allies with both Germany and Japan that we have to this day with the alliances. But we did that, the Army of the Liberation, as segregated soldiers. Most people forget that the soldiers who fought in World War II were segregated in white units and Black units. That was common. That had been true since the Civil War, when Black soldiers were first allowed to enlist. And we had done that for all the wars since, for almost a century, because we believed that Black soldiers were not as capable as white soldiers. But Harry Truman in 1948, with an executive order putting together a committee, ended that. And so it's only relatively recently, in the context of history, when you consider that we had more decades and more wars fighting with segregated soldiers than we have with integrated military units. And Harry Truman addressed that, helping bring, if you will, access to the American dream through the military. And the reason I say access to the military, American dream through the military, is because many soldiers who fought, who were not white, often did so to prove their patriotism, to prove that they too are full Americans, that they too are willing to commit and risk that sacrifice. And in recognition of that, Truman understood that and had this executive order. So the military is very much intertwined with notions of civil rights and participating equally in the American dream. And so speaking of participating equally in the American dream, that leads us to the civil rights movement. Now, Martin Luther King, I have his lifespan there because his life, of course, was cut short. He could still be alive today at an age of, he would be 93 years old, younger than my grandmother. And Martin Luther King, of course, is not him by himself in doing this movement. You can see, many people there on the Washington Mall. And of course, he was not the only leader, but we see him as the face of the civil rights movement. It's no surprise that the civil rights movement took place in the aftermath of the World War II, because many soldiers, as big as World War II was, many soldiers came home and they thought, well, why did I serve my country and I'm treated as a second-class citizen here? Remember, we still had Jim Crow segregation through and after the end of World War II. It's not until Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decides in 1954 that legally ends segregation, although it would take another 20 years to actually implement some of those laws. So you think about it, yes, we may have integrated the military shortly after World War II, but society on the home front was still segregated. So some soldiers, or veterans in this case, would come home and recognize that, and that ignited a certain passion and a certain movement to say, well, maybe we should do something about this. And many people came to the fore, but Martin Luther King being one of the big figureheads that we remember today. And on the left there is the home that he grew up in, another site that I used to work as a park ranger, as I did at the Civil War, and now here at the civil rights, at a civil rights site right in downtown Atlanta, the home of Martin Luther King as a child. Now, I don't work there anymore, but what it did to me is it reminded me that I was dealing with some of the same issues that I had seen from events that took place a century prior, historically. And the moment that I remember most transcends even people here in the United States. I was standing there on that porch that you see with the door and the staircase. And I was leading a group of kids with a chaperone, kids between age 9 and 13, scarred, some of them lashes on the neck. One of them had his skull pushed in. Clearly, these kids had been through a lot. And they didn't really speak English. In speaking to the chaperone, as I was on that porch walking up the stairs, the chaperone revealed to me that these kids were slaves, escaped slaves. This is in 2010. Escaped slaves in 2010, aged 9 to 13. So let's call it born around the year 2000, plus or minus, that escaped from the illegal human trafficking trade in Haiti. They had only recently come to the United States through this program that the chaperone helped lead. And the site that they said they wanted to see was the home of Martin Luther King. To me, it was such a powerful example of two things. First, the power of place. They wanted to see the place, to be there, to feel connected, as I did with this pen and when I was at the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. But two, the power of the American dream through a figure like Martin Luther King to transcend just those of us that live in the United States, to be global and across time. Because remember, Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. These kids were born 30 plus years later and were in front of me 40 plus years after Martin Luther King had been killed. And yet this legacy meant something. The American dream to them meant something. The land of opportunity, the image of it meant something to them, and they connected to it through history. More recently, when we look across these issues that we deal with, one way we think about the American dream and access to it is on our currency. What you see there is myself doing a TV program on a CBS station on the American Women Quarters program that is by the US Mint, ongoing from 2022 to 2025. This is the first year, 2022, that they did it. That is that they have 5 women a year honored for 4 years. So that is 20 women across the 4 years, 5 times 4, on the back of the quarter. And I brought this with me here today. You can see the quarters right here. That same prop that you see that is on the TV screen. These are the 5 women currently in 2022. And you can see that these 5 women, who you can pull up if you just Google US Mint American Women's Quarters Program, you will find it. Just make sure you're going to the usmint.gov website, so you're going direct to their website. And of course, on the other side is George Washington, as you see here, and expanded on the screen as I gave one example with Maya Angelou, who's one of the women who is honored. Now, I want to emphasize this. These are not commemorative coins. They're not silver. They're not collectors' items, although you might collect them, but they're not being made just for collecting. They're circulating in our pockets. You can go to your bank and ask for it. You can buy rolls of the quarters from the US Mint. Because currency, money, is where nations honor their heroes. And it literally carries value because it's worth something. And we carry it in our pockets. And what you see on screen there is on par with George Washington. Of course, another American hero, perhaps the American hero. But on the other side is Maya Angelou, a poet, social activist of the 20th century. One of the most famous and transcendent folks to talk about and bring attention to so many social issues, both in Martin Luther King's era, all the way into the 2000s, when she won multiple national awards, recognition from the United States presidents, multiple US presidents, speaking at Bill Clinton's inauguration, making history, being awarded a National Medal of Freedom from President Obama. What's interesting here to me is that it shows you that there are 2 sides to a coin, that there are multiple ways to look at the American dream. There are multiple access points, multiple people to consider in different groups and experiences, whether it's that of George Washington and the leaders and the founders that established these ideals codified them into laws for us to follow, for us to build upon, for us to take for granted and assume that everyone else did, which they didn't at the time. But also have the heroes that come in, like Maya Angelou and others more recently, who help tell us to complete the picture, complete the ideals that were in the Virginia Declaration of Independence, complete the ideals that Thomas Jefferson wrote about, complete the ideals that, if we go before the United States, folks like John Edwards and John Winthrop were talking about, that new birth that both Edwards and later Abraham Lincoln, the new birth of freedom, referred to, while still providing the economic opportunity for everyone, as we saw with Jamestown having that economic opportunity be a key part. Because remember, at the time, England was a poor nation. So whether we're looking at the colonial era, looking at the revolution, looking at the expansion west, the Civil War, the Second World War, the Army of Liberation, the Civil Rights, and today with the money in our pocket, we see these themes of the American dream being defined, redefined, permeating our thought process, and of course, having folks raise the questions of who gets to participate. Now, I cover these issues a lot, and you can find me in doing so on television, but also for free, both on my own TV show and local TV stations. If you check out the YouTube channel, Celebrity Historian, you see a lot of my content posted there with my appearances across the country, or any of the websites you see down the middle there, more about me at raffiandonian.com, or if you want to watch my TV show where I deal with some of these issues in the present day with interviews of live people today, you can go to cleothemuse.tv/watch, free access as well, or celebrityhistorian.com to find more of the variety of things I put together to help us discuss how we remember historic sites and how history tells the stories of the American dream and who gets to participate. And so with that, we'll bring this tie to a conclusion, to tie together and understand that across the centuries, we've always been debating the meanings of the American dream. It is nothing new to do so today. It's been going on for centuries and will continue on. And that's why in the United States, we have such wonderful dialogue on these issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and, the journey you took us through, throughout the, history of the US and the different people involved, but also the different perspectives, as you mentioned with that one painting, Manifest Destiny. Who was it, serving, and who was it hurting, and who was being left out in that notion of the American dream in that time? So one of the questions that I do have for you, what role do formal organizations such as museums and archives play in contributing to the belief of the American dream? And I know you spoke on how you've served, multiple various capacities, both at Gettysburg and also at Martin Luther King Jr.'s house.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the museums and archives, are critical. For example, one of the documents I pulled up was the Virginia Declaration of Rights. We saw an image of the document, right? That's from an archive. But museums tell these stories, right? Museums are artifacts. I pulled out a couple of these right here. And this, to me, they're not exactly artifacts, but they are material things that connect us to the past. Now, of course, to get actual artifacts, these things are a way to tell the story and convey and help people remember that, these issues are ongoing, have been happening in the past. But also, I think people forget the power that museums have to construct a narrative. And I think museums need to take that very carefully, because what happens is, if you have inaccuracies in there, it starts to become a problem because there's credibility to an institution, right? So we have to be very careful as institutions, whether we're doing programming or have artifacts or whatever it is, we're doing public facing stuff, to make sure that we're being accurate, but also, I think, multi-layered. There are multiple perspectives that are correct, right? And those perspectives all should be represented, both the George Washington and the Maya Angelou, right? And so I think that museums and archives and public sites are critical to doing so. As you saw with the story with the slaves that I met, look how important a public site was to them in interacting with the American dream, right? That is what makes it real. I love reading. I have 3,000 books, but there is a difference between that, which you need to do also, but making it come alive. My interest in history came when I was a little kid in 5th grade, going to Philadelphia, seeing Constitution Hall, and seeing the old row houses, to me, that made history come alive. I was a kid in California. I had no connections to the East Coast. My parents are immigrants. I have no connections to the American Revolution from a family lineage standpoint. I'm the first generation born in the United States. But when I went to Philadelphia, history came alive for me. And it's from that moment, obviously, that look what I have grown into, right? Having an interest
Mhm.
in this and trying to do it for the public. So that's the power that these sites, museums, and archives have in telling these stories, inspiring people, and also making sure that we have degrees of accuracy with multiple perspectives.
And how has nationalism and symbolism, impacted the American dream as a concept? I definitely think this, circles right back to the painting you showed as one of those examples. But I was wondering if you can expand further, maybe talk about some other examples that have been really dominant throughout history, like Uncle Sam, the little Uncle Sam wants you posters, stuff like that.
Yeah, World War II is very much, has nationalism involved, right? It's Western expansion, Cold
Hmm.
War, right? You think about the Cold War, that I think needs its own treatment. Nationalism is a big part of the American dream. Think about, for example, in the context of the Cold War. In the Cold War, you had this binary, right? You have the stark contrast, right, between the United States, which is the land of liberty, and of course, the evil empire, as Reagan called it, with the USSR. And it doesn't end there. There's a series of engagements and all kinds of foreign operations that we as the United States are involved in because we're worried about the spread of communism, right? There's a domino theory, which is what, is partly what leads to the war in Vietnam or some of our relations in Latin America for decades. So it's not just about Russia, right? And the Russian Empire. But really what I think is that in that process, you have a nationalism that's developing that says, look, our way in the United States is the right way. And that other way, the contrast, is the wrong way, right? And in that process, the very famous moment I remember is the kitchen debates. Now, I don't remember it personally, I was not around, but but you have US President Nixon meeting with the leader of the USSR. And what's happening is, in the USSR, in the Soviet Union, you have, I think it's like three choices for the kitchen gadgets, right? And the kitchen appliances. In the
Hmm.
US, you have countless choices. And one is saying you don't need that many choices. And the other is saying, no, part of what freedom means that you have all those choices. So
Hmm.
interlaced with that, again, is both ideology and economics, right? Like these things are connected, like Virginia and Massachusetts in the colonial days, because the ideology of freedom, right? Well, what does freedom mean? It means I can consume more, I can consume differently, right? And I can
Hmm.
have these gadgets in my kitchen. And that is what the kitchen debate symbolizes, this way of life argument. And there's a material part attached to that because there's prosperity. And you saw in the Virginia, the Declaration of Rights, they're talking about life, liberty, pursuing happiness, and property. These things are connected, right? Or if I'm going to come out of school and buy a house, well, that's, again, property. We're talking about material things. This has
Hmm.
always been part of the American dream, right? And so the nationalism part to me is often used to contrast against other ways that are incorrect, whether it's the perceived savages of the West who are one with nature and not civilized in the perspective of these folks, of course, to the fight we have, with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, to, of course, ourselves being the Liberation Army in World War II with issues that were not directly connected to us, but eventually kind of come into our scope, in part because of diplomatic alliances, of course, but you cannot separate diplomatic alliances and nationalism altogether. And that's part of the reason we come into the war later, this Second World War, we come into it later compared to much of the rest of the world. So nationalism is intimately intertwined. And I'd finally add, more recently, when you look at presidential slogans, they're very much playing on nationalism, right?
Hmm.
And when you think about, Donald Trump and you think about Make America Great Again, Make America Great Again is, of course, a reference to many things, but it is referring specifically to an image that is held, that is being portrayed, of making the United States great again. That is some kind of, I think that's, to me, an echo of the city on a hill, right? You're thinking about the shining moment that we had, and you want to bring it back. And what that means also, though, is nationalistic because it's an America first policy, right? That's literally what he would say, is America first. So the
Hmm.
nationalism and that opportunity are very much intertwined. It's not always in war, but also just in our rhetoric.
And America has always kind of been described as, a melting pot for various cultures as a way of kind of defining what American culture means. just given the history being so unique compared to, European countries or other countries across the world. Um, but historically, when those various cultures, enter the melting pot, they're not always represented in the national rhetoric or the national imagery, because as you were saying, a lot of it's more the, oh, if you were white, not, oh, if you were Irish or French or German or something like that, it forces that, blending inherently. So, in your opinion, did that notion kind of always go hand in hand with the American dream of, a pseudo forced assimilation of, leaving all of your heritage behind to become part of America and the American dream?
I don't think it always goes hand in hand. I think it often does. I wouldn't use the word always. And the
Mhm.
reason I say that is because it depends who you ask, right? Part of what's
Mhm.
interesting about the American dream is I don't think we all agree on what the American dream is, right? We have this broad notion that we've been kind of touching on of,
Mhm.
prosperity, access, these kinds of things. But what does that mean, right? Like, what does it mean to, should we have equal opportunity or equal outcomes, right? Is one of the things that we debate all the time, right? So I think that depending on who you ask, there's more to some people are going to say, well, yeah, assimilation is part of, the American dream. That's how we come together. But others are going to say, no, well, it's this diversity and this multiculturalism that helps make the United States. I think at different points, both have some kind of perspective. As usual, the reality is some kind of complicated synthesis of all these.
Mhm.
And it also depends on your perspective, your world, your experience, and your community. For example, my dad, who I mentioned is an immigrant, escaped from a communist regime, in Romania. His family came here for opportunity because of the American dream. I mean, it was very personal for me, right? And he
Mhm.
started a business, not right away, but shortly after, that was successful for decades. And that's how I grew up in a middle class family. You ask him what that American dream means, I think it's going to mean something different to compared to, for example, a former sharecropper in Georgia who I remember was a janitor in a building I used to work at, and the conversations I had with him, versus you ask someone who maybe lives in New York City and comes from an affluent family, like say the Roosevelt family came. You know what I mean? So depending on who you ask, I think they're going to have different versions of the American dream and different desires for the level of assimilation or not. And I think that's part of the reason we go into these clashes sometimes because we don't always agree. So I wouldn't say always it's required. I
Mhm.
think it depends on the perspective and the community you draw around you, right?
Yeah.
Where you live has something to do with that. The local community you have, are you in an ethnic neighborhood? Are you not? All these different perspectives really come into play. Now, I will point out it's also fluid. So, for example, you think about Mexicans in California in the 1940s. Mexican Americans, so people of Mexican descent, and sometimes Mexican immigrants, are being classified in all kinds of different ways in a period of like 10 years. There's a point where they're classified as white, then they're classified as Mexican, then they're classified as not white, and all these different classifications. Well, the people are the same people. All we're doing is moving the identification boundaries that we box people into according to our social categories, right? So when I think of when I hear the term assimilation and multiculturalism, I also think that it's not entirely up to you, but it's these kind of systems we have, these social categorizations we have that could make you assimilated or not, depending on how we classify you in different circumstances, right? So that I think that these situations are always fluid. And there's think about the Irish, in much worse shape in the 19th century than they are in the 20th century as far as how they're accepted, right? How about Catholics, which is connected to why the Irish were not liked? It's not the only reason, but there are other Catholics that are disliked, like Italians and German Catholics. Okay, what you know, that's not so much an issue anymore, right? Being Catholic, although before it was, right? So and it connects to the American dream because there was this notion that Catholics are loyal to a foreign prince, which is the Pope. That foreign prince is what the term a lot of the
Mhm.
founding generation used. And that maybe made them so that their loyalties are, questioned. So there's that nationalism part again, right? And how purely can they participate in the American dream? Now we don't think of it so much that way. It does. I feel like occasionally, it rarely does pop up here and there, but it's of course not as prominent as it was. My point though is the fluidity. These things change across time as well, such that I hesitate to use the term always, but all these things can be true at once.
Mhm. And this program is funded under the A More Perfect Union initiative from the National Endowment for the Humanities, with the goal to help celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. How do you think the American dream can be used moving forward to help create a more perfect union and bring, you know, again, that melting pot of our country, together rather than the way it's been sometimes used in the past of, creating divides, whether intentionally or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And it has been used to create divide, right? For many times. I think the way, I mean, it's funny. I think again of that quarter, right? I think it's telling more inclusive stories, right? The
Mhm.
quarter now has, intentionally, because with the American Women Quarters Program, both, our father of our country, George Washington, who I don't think we have to necessarily bash in order to make room for Maya Angelou and other historic women. Both things can be true. And so I think a way forward is to play a game of addition, not subtraction, is to not necessarily, say, well, we have to, you win, I lose, or you lose, I win, right? It's not a zero sum game to me. We can just grow the pie. I think the stories are infinite. We have so many ways to tell these stories, so many ways to commemorate, whether it's two sides of a quarter or many, many other ways, right? So I would like to see for the American dream, when we're thinking about it, to understand number one, that everyone's American dream is a little bit different based on their position and their
Mhm.
situation, as I just described earlier, right? My family situation and other family situations. But number two, now that we have these perspectives on the American dream based on their experiences, their lived experiences are going to be different, right? Because you and I are going to have different lived experiences, different geographies, different all kinds of things. Now, how do we make room in our public forums and discussions and dialogue and symbols such as currency, our public squares, the cities, etc.? How do we make room for all of them? And I do think that we can do that without saying we have to take this down to put that up or vice versa, right? It's kind of like in any relationship, I think if you try to win at the expense of someone else, I think that's problematic. And I feel like that can be an endless cycle where,
Mhm.
well, now next time you win the arm wrestling match and you stick it to me.
Mhm.
So now did we actually like get anywhere constructive and build? Whereas I think if you just keep growing the pie and doing that addition that I'm describing, then we can say, okay, there is room for all these different stories. And all these different stories allow more people to engage with the American dream and history, which I think to me is important because I don't want history to feel like it's exclusive. So to me, it's a
Mhm.
game of inclusion.
Awesome, and I think that's a wonderful way to close out the talk that you just gave, and thank you again for all of your insight and all of your knowledge that you just shared.
Thank you.